Hey guys, welcome to today's episode of Tea Time, Hot or Not. I'm Maddie.
And I'm Ashton.
And today we're going to be talking a little bit about how French fashion affects costume design of the early 1700s and 1800s.
It's going to be a good time because a lot of people have that question, does art imitate life or does life imitate art? So we're going to kind of help answer that question by seeing whether or not culture does influence the costuming decisions within theater, which we think we found a good example. But Maddie, I think we have a problem.
What's that?
I feel like if we're going to do this, we need to go all out and we need to be the French, have that exude from us.
You know, I think you're right.
All right, well in that case, let's do this.
That's better.
Yeah.
Well, behind all the romanticized silk and tulle of these lavish outfits lies an entirely different story, one of war, greed, and an epic fall from grace.
Well, buckle up because this is going to be a ride as we tell you guys about the history of the 17 and 1800s and how that societal influence may have impacted theater costume decisions a little differently. To understand costuming decisions, we first have to look at what was going on within theater and who the audience was. In this case, in the 1700s in France, it was mainly the upper class that was going to the theater because they were the ones who could afford it. That means they're also the only ones who could afford such elaborate fashion as we're wearing right now. So that's why the theater use this, because they're appealing to the current audience that they have.
Makes a lot of sense. I mean, if costume design was really inspired by the rich, made for the rich, then it makes a lot of sense, right? But what happened in the 18th century? Because we see that in Louis's The Bells from 1871, that suddenly they've gone away from these more elaborate style dresses and they're a lot simpler.
Yeah, so that happens because as society continues on and advances, it has such an impact on theater, not just with costuming, but with every aspect of it, that theater has to change as well. So for instance, at one time, Britain actually banned plays because they were going against the head of state and the head of church, as well as some churches would, for their congregations, put on biblical shows of stories that they had grown up learning about within their scriptures. And there's even times where they pose philosophical questions, or even just challenge societal norms at times, so it just is very impacted by society. Therefore, it stands to reason that as, say, fashion changes happen within society, so will costume decisions within theater.
Makes sense. It's kind of like how Rent in the 90s had those acid wash jeans and all the leather and stuff, because that was really popular for the time.
Exactly.
So I mean, I guess when you think about it that way, then maybe potentially in the future, maybe we could have productions in which people are wearing masks, not because that's what's going on in the production itself, but because that was literally the trend of our time now.
Exactly. That's what we think will happen in the future. Well, hopefully.
Hopefully not.
Maybe. I don't know. I kind of want to forget this whole pandemic. Anyways, but if we want to understand what's going to happen in the present or in the future, we first have to look back into the past. So let's go through some French history real quick and we'll get you caught up on what's going on before we dive into theater. You ready to go?
Yep,
All right,
let's
let's
go.
do it.
In the Fashion Timeline project produced by the New York Institute of Design and Technology, it's observed that throughout most of the 18th century, men and women's costume design and men and women's fashion was heavily influenced by the French style clothing. And this really set the standard through Europe throughout most of the 18th century. Women's fashion design usually consisted of embroidered silk gowns, usually with long trains and hoop skirts and petticoats. They would pair this with some pointed shoes or high heels for their feet. And these dresses usually had a lot of lace, a lot of detailed elements to them, as well as long sleeves that had the extra frills around here. And these were usually all accompanied with obviously the hairstyles of the time, which would be very big, stylized buns with the ringlets coming out of them. Now, if you want a good example of what a fashion icon looks like in the 1700s, look no further than Marie Adelaide. So she has quite a compelling history. So she grew up as a woman of the upper class, and she was the eldest daughter of Victor Amadis II. He was the Duke of Savoy. They lived in France. And so she, at age 14, ended up marrying the king of the time. She was described as being doll-sized, and everybody aspired to be her. They thought she was the most beautiful, most picturesque looking woman there was. And because of her status, she had a lot of pictures painted of her, which meant that so many girls had the opportunity to look up to her and see kind of the things that she wore and try to imitate that and copy that in their own lives. Kind of like in our modern day example of how we're obsessed with British royalty, these people were obsessed with her being French royalty. It's interesting because when Marie Adelaide's picture featured in a family portrait exhibit at the Palace of Versailles is compared to a costume design featured in New York Public Library's digital collection of works depicting theater dresses inspired by Old English styles, it's clear to see that the similarities are definitely there in terms of form, style, and embellishment.
Now, for the men's fashion of this time period, it usually consisted of a three-piece silk or wool suit that consisted of a overcoat, a waistcoat, some breeches, socks, and boots. And then there are variations such as you can change up the ascot that you were wearing, the amount of frills that you want, how thick that you want the ends of your sleeves. There are a lot of variations, but this typically was what was worn. There was also wigs that they typically wore that were powdered, typically like you see in the old colonial photos. I'm not wearing them.
Now, another important person in this time of history is a man by the name of Thomas Jeffries. Now, why is he important? Well, because the very thing that we're trying to talk to you about and educate you on, he already has done. He did it in a book called Principal Characters of the English Stage, where he talked about in 500 pages of the fashion trends of the early 1700s and how those trends impacted the stage within theater. So these are a couple of his sketches that we're going to look at real quick. And this is from his sketch book titled Habit of an English Gentleman about 1700. Now this is part of a display within the VA Museum, and it's clear to see how the similarities are truly uncanny. Worn in the production of Lucius Seneca's Medea in the early 1700s, the character King Aida displays a red color, where you tend to see his features in a common coat are more embellished than others, and this is to denote his royal status, as well as to make him apparent and evident whenever he walks into a room.
Elaborate fashion, big parties, and epic exclusive rides to theater. It seemed like the sun would never stop shining down on the lords and ladies of the 17th century. But suddenly, as we got towards the latter end of the century, everything started to change.
And that's because the people want to change. I can start seeing the memes right now about that. So what started happening at the end of the 18th century was that there was a lot of revolutions going on in Europe, specifically in France. There was the French Revolution at the turn of the century, just before it. And what this was it threw over the aristocracy and the monarchy that was going on in France and actually put the middle class in power to establish what they named their government the First Republic. So, and what this does is for theater, if there's no longer a upper class that they can basically cater to, their audience now has to become the middle class, now the dominating class. And they won't accept a lot of the extravagant clothing that the upper class wore. So how does the theater appeal and cater to that new audience that they have? They change the costumes to what the middle class is wearing, which is what we tend to see after this moment.
Exactly. At this point in time, we see that our elaborate, giant silk gowns and simply spectacular tailored suits are going to digress a little bit more towards everyday things. Everyday, I guess, clothing for the working class. And this is where we're going to see that shift in not only these fashion trends, but also in theater as well. As we're going to see, as some of these images are going to show you, these styles are heavily reflected, once again in theater, going from more of the really grand costuming to things more like you'd see in a Jane Austen movie. A lot more simple, a lot more, I guess, workable, that came along with the different duties and responsibilities that these upper class people and these middle class people would now have to play.
A few other examples could be The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde, or Jekyll and Hyde, or Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, as my partner was mentioning. There are a lot of different things that can happen, and for the men, one of the main fashion changes that happen is that George Brummel from Britain actually started changing this attire from the upper class, as he was one, to he actually changed it up and made the waistcoat come up a little bit higher, made the overcoat not have tails, and he made the pants full length so that they weren't exposing those down ankles. And what this actually is this was the inspiration for the modern day suit coat for men.
And that's kind of where we beg the question. We got to pose the question, does art imitate life or does life imitate art? And I think in this case, with the facts that we presented, it's pretty easy to see that at least when it comes to theater and costume design, that art really does imitate life and the social circumstances at the time. Well, we've now taken you on a journey through the 1700s and the 1800s and how the different revolutions have led to changing times and changing fashion trends, as well as being reflected in costume design, which means that at this point in time, it's probably appropriate for us to go like this to this.
That's a lot more comfortable. Thanks,
Definitely.
Maddie.
Definitely.
All right, well, thank you guys for joining us for Tea Time today, Hot or Not French Fashion. We hope that we've educated you a little bit on how society and fashion ideas do impact the costume decisions within theater. We had a good time putting this together for you, and we hope you have a good rest of your day. See you later.